Tony at the camera. Guillermo, my friend. He's going to start out reading a poem. This is really bereavement now. We're starting with the bereavement this time. We set up the bereavement in Part A, so if you haven't seen Part A, I think you should go to that first. The video that's a part of it. And I'm Teddy Tarr, one of your neighborhood psychologists. And here we go.
I'm going to read a poem, Heartbreak at Daybreak. Duncan was about 11 when I forgot him at school one day. I still thank God that the principal went back to school that afternoon around 5 o'clock. I was busy preparing supper when I got a call from a very upset principal. I never forgot the incident. At times, I will bring it up in conversation, and I will tell Duncan how bad I feel about it and how truly sorry I am. He would very graciously tell me it is not a big deal. After Duncan passed away, I had a very hard time with that. Was he so insignificant that I could not even remember to pick him up when he was finished with his after-school activities? As I worked through my grief, one of my assignments was to go back to the place of the accident, just around the corner from our house, and promised Duncan I would never again forget him and to write a poem about the accident. Just around the corner. Since you hit that tree, just around the corner, that took so far away from me. I became your mourner. We passed by your car, just around the corner, with your blood on the road, just a few blocks from home. The darkness mercifully hide what is left on your tragedy. It was the breaking of day, and I began to pray as pain overwhelms me and I'm unable to speak. Words cannot describe you, your deeds honest and true. From now until eternity, I will never again forget you. Psalm 42:11. Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my continuance and my God.
Okay, I wanted to include this. Elizabeth is writing in fact, she's written a whole book of her journey. She's had a lot of sorrow and a lot of really hard work to be the person she is today and to be able to help others. And what bereavement does, it puts us in a place where the brain goes back. The brain hates bereavement. It goes back and it takes a fabric and it pulls one thread at a time and goes through every single part of the relationship. Every time you walk in Publix or wherever you shop, what you bought for that person, what that person liked and didn't like. For a long time, you don't get to make one step anywhere without those thoughts and those feelings. And they're very, very painful. And what the brain is doing, it's trying to get you to own the sadness and work through the sadness and to let go of the sadness. It wants to move on. The hardest part is if it doesn't have answers. If it doesn't have any answers. If someone's in their 90s, they have to be in their 90s today, they can be in their 80s and going to one of the colleges, finishing a degree. But if someone is elderly and has lost everyone, has been sick for a period of time, that's a different kind of bereavement. But someone young and younger, someone who has a lot to live for, someone who is a community member, someone we know, all we have to do is know that person to be in bereavement. It doesn't take more than that. But I wanted to mention that the brain doesn't give up on the relationship. It just doesn't. It will keep working through it. I'd say probably 1 to 3 years on something uncomplicated, just regular mourning, and probably 3 years and an eternity with complicated mourning, anniversaries, special occasions. My father couldn't walk my daughter down the aisle, whatever it is. Those things continue to come back, and over time, hopefully, if we work through things, we learn to live with them and to manage them. They don't go away. They don't go away in time. All right, Guillermo.
Well, we can develop a sense of hopelessness at times, especially with losses. We feel deserted, confused, overwhelmed, emotionally overloaded. We replay early periods when we felt safe. We also return to our mistakes as children who experience a loss. Depressed, grief-stricken, angry at separation, angry at the death, repressed events, pain is unbearable.
Also, a baby grieves. I mentioned in our first video that about taking a child, if somebody calls me about culturally doing whatever is expected, but if they're asking me whether or not to take the child, always put the child with someone who is not grieving quite as much. But a baby grieves, we know that.
Separation anxiety begins before the cognitive structure allows awarenesses.
Today we know also that our brains are not fully formed until we're like almost 26. That frontal lobe is not finished.
Our neurons record events with emotions. We split these two apart, storing the emotional residue in a boneyard, unaware on a conscious level where it all came from. We now know cells stored not just in our brain. We learn to withhold our verbal expression of both anger and fear. As children, when something bad happens, we think we caused it. It's called magical thinking.
It's called magical thinking if we think we caused something. For instance, I'm mad at you and I say to you, because you got this new car now sitting out there, and I say to you, you know, I wish something would happen to the car. And then something happens. We don't forgive ourselves so easy. And you can imagine how it would be with bereavement. Very, very sorrowful.
We're born with a particular temperament.
Okay, that temperament has a lot to do with whether or not we're real emotional or whether or not we're pretty stoic, and we don't normally show a lot of emotion. I think that's important to know. We're all very, very different. So, do you want to read also the Grief, Bereavement, and Hope? This is from a father who had a loss and who's in a group, and someone is challenging, why is he still in this group? Why does he still go to a bereavement group?
Well, can we go to a question?
Sure,
Before
absolutely.
we read that, so you can give me a break to my eyes that I don't
Yes,
have my glasses
yes,
on.
we can. Oh, I'm so sorry. No, I'm not. Okay.
What is the best thing to do if you have a family member who is facing a life-threatening illness, is dying, or cannot get over a loss, is threatening his own life? How do you handle that?
You know, there are lots of ways to look at something, and if someone's come in here for that reason, for that purpose, what I usually say is there's no such thing as dying. There's dead, and there's alive. And as long as somebody isn't dead, they've got to be alive. So, what can you do? Hearing is probably the last thing to go. We still think that. As far as I know, nothing's changed on that. Being able to, you know, if you happen to play, if you have somebody in the hospital, of course now we have different rules. But normally, let's say the person's at home. 80% of our population was dying in the hospital. Now I don't know what that percentage is. I have no idea. But if they're home, let's say they're homebound, let's say you have hospice or whatever, you talking to people, acting like they're still alive. We know, reviewing a past, Butler had a great theory that just by reviewing who they were and some of the accomplishments, if they're able to talk and they're able to listen, going over pictures, you can always show a picture, a letter, you can read a letter from someone. I tell people all the time to take an autograph book and have everybody in the family write something, and then you can read to them. You know, we don't understand at the end of life exactly how much somebody's getting, but if you do the things you need to do, then you can let go.
You can let go.
And you're the one who's having to let go now. So I think what's important is if they like music, you don't want to play country music if they always like, you know, steel. That's so bad. But if there's something, if you know them really well, to be able to bring in something comforting. And certainly, if they're a person of faith, then you'd want to include somebody of the faith to help you.
Okay, you want me to read this?
Yep. Grief, bereavement, and hope.
I was recently asked, why are you still working with bereavers support groups? It's been 60 years since your son Kevin's death. Aren't you over your grief yet? I didn't have an immediate answer. In fact, it took some time thinking about how I really wanted to answer the two-part questions. 1, how do I think? 2, how do I feel? To answer the question fully, I needed to think about my own personal definition of bereavement and grief. My current definition is quite different than when I first began my bereavement process. Today, I define bereavement as a processing, thinking, and adjusting to the return of hope. And when hope is regained, I believe that bereavement is completed, over. Now grief is quite a different brag. My current definition of grief is a feeling of sheer pain, agony that takes hope away seemingly forever. Webster has slightly different definition of the two. You may want to check it out against your own belief system. The answer to the first part is, my bereavement is over and my work on my loss is completed. I still, however, have and will probably always have a need to promote hope for all the people I meet and know who are in emotional pain. Hope is the light at the end of the tunnel and the necessary ingredient that lets you go on almost as before. So my reason for still being around is clear to me. My grief, on the other hand, will always be part of who I have become. So the answer to the second part is, no, not yet. My grief has improved to the point that I no longer have those feelings of hopelessness I felt in the early years. I promise I will let you all know when my grief is over, if and when that occurs.
You know, I think we want to speak for other people. And we have, the only person wearing a watch is the bereaved person. They're the only one that can tell us how they're feeling and where they are. And sometimes, you know, it's almost embarrassing and disrespectful to suggest to somebody that they need to see somebody professional. It is normal for someone to be in a lot of pain, normal for them to be symptomatic, and normal that they're not going to cure this. It's like mental illness doesn't get cured all the time, it gets managed. So I also want to mention that bereavement is like in the very beginning, there's a dropper of what's happened and not a bucket, so that we can get through this period of time of, in the beginning, to even have the funeral. Our brains couldn't take a whole bucket. So there's a dropper of bereavement. It's called adaptation. And that adaptive mourning or adaptive grief helps us to be able to manage it in the beginning. Getting professional help if necessary, but there's a lot of self-help, and I'm a firm believer in self-help materials. This is, for sure, my very favorite poem in the whole world. Time's passing means nothing to loss. Guillermo?
It stalks you like a cat, like a root. Whenever you stumble on it, it is right there. It yawns across the vastness of a smoothly made bed. In the kitchen, it stirs in the empty chair, or it sits at the next table in the restaurant. With that profile, you cannot stop glancing at. Loss keeps picking up the thread of the conversation. It imagines it's still in the middle of it, but the thread doesn't go anywhere. Loss forgets it cannot pick up the telephone and call until its hands is in mid-air. Loss can sleep like the dead, like a snake curled up in the warm rocks, but it wakes up hungry, with venom and fangs intact. Loss forgets what it can and cannot have. Loss never forgets what he wants.
Absolutely. What it wants is your undivided attention. No matter how much you have, no matter how well off you are, that doesn't change the fact that you cannot focus on anything else. The grief is overwhelming. Over time, you can learn to, especially if you have a job. A lot of times people go to professionals because they need someone to help them pull the grief in and to organize it in a place where they can put it, like at lunchtime, so they can go back to work or whatever. And never expect a boss to, what? Do you go around and say every day, who's had a loss? No. Oh, you can take off today? No. You know, what? How much time do they get off? 3 days?
Yes.
3 days, usually. Time for the funeral. And people have all kinds of, unfortunately, people actually lie and say some people have died 4 times in 2 years. You know?
Yeah, very, very family-oriented.
Yes, very. But it's the same aunt. Unfortunately, it's the same aunt in Michigan. All right. So, grief is a tiresome journey one embarks upon alone, upon a train called sorrow, endlessly hurling towards stations unknown. Grief is the pain and desolation, bruised mind, body, and soul, anger, fear, and rejection, emotions out of control. Grief is a swirling maelstrom, a vortex of despair and loss, abandonment, loneliness and shame. The struggle for sanity comes at a great cost. Grief is the bridge to acceptance, spanning waters both troubled and deep. Peaceful healing and forgiveness will be grief's bounty that we reap. All very, very difficult. No one knows how difficult except the mourner. You have no choice with bereavement. You get a phone call and you're in bereavement. That's a state. You have no choice that you have grief. You're now, depending on the relationship, in major loss like the poem. But you have lots of choices about mourning. You can choose not to mourn. You can decide to put that person in the elevator, push a button, and send them to heaven. People do that sometimes. That can work. I have seen it work. I have never tried to tell somebody it doesn't work. However, that's not for the faint of heart. Most of us cannot do that. Most of us, we have to work through the bereavement. We cannot just close it off and send it someplace. And that's true of the majority of people that have to address it for at least a little bit of time, depending on the relationship. So we have some high risk factors for bereavement, and these are the folks who are going to have more of a problem going through it. Do you have any more questions for me that I could throw one out there now?
Yeah, what is disenfranchised grief?
Oh, the disenfranchised? How do I explain disenfranchised? It's mourning where one is not considered a legitimate mourner. Let's say it's an ex-wife or an ex-husband, and the children want you to come with them. And by the way, when you hear the news, you can get back in touch with when you married that person. Maybe you had a childhood with them. Maybe you met them when you were 16 or 17. The mourning doesn't stop just because you've divorced that person. You can go back and look at the whole life you had with that person, and maybe you have children with that person, and you want to go to the funeral without permission. And it would take a note. That would be what I would suggest, a note stating that I would like to go with the children, and I will sit at the back, and I know that this is something that I'm requesting. You don't have to give me permission, and that you could do. But I would never think that one should just push one's way into a funeral any more than one would push one's way into a party. How's that? Is that pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay. So, high risk?
Want me to read?
Yeah.
Sudden, unanticipated loss. Results of a lengthy illness. Loss of a child. Perception of preventability. Ambivalences in a relationship.
Ambivalence is, I love you and I hate you. A lot of ambivalence. Things were good, but things have been bad. Things have been good, things have been bad. Those relationships are very tough to go through and to grieve.
Mental health problems.
Yep.
Perceived lack of social support.
Not only mental health problems, but if you have someone who is disabled or disadvantaged, or you have a child that has special needs, they may not even be allowed to go. Now, you can certainly put them with someone who could take them out if necessary, but they can be disenfranchised because of their special needs. Yeah.
Perceived lack of social support.
Yep, if you don't think, it's not about who's there. It's not about who's there, how many people you have. Do you consider them supportive? Are they there for you, is the question. You can't get a handle, yeah.
Cannot get a handle how to prevent. 125,000 dying in the US. This is the virus. I'm talking about the virus now.
Yeah.
And over the world is even more.
All over the world, and you know what? So many of our population come from other places.
Yeah.
And also, I saw something and I thought it was great. I wish I had copied it down who said it. But when you finish with your own loss and you finish with your own grief, think about mine and care that I'm grieving. And I like that.
And it's not going away. The anxiety is there.
Yep.
Every day. Cannot visit the hospital, bombardment of the news.
Yep. Cannot
culturally administer to family and friends with a gathering, funeral, celebration of life, parties. In other words, they're restricting us from actually having those things.
Having a group, yeah.
Senseless.
How about even trying to get someplace? You know, people are still afraid of flying. And there are many places where you have a 2-week quarantine.
If you have to check where you're going, because if you go somewhere where there's 2 weeks quarantine, you cannot even go out of the hotel or the house for 2 weeks.
Right. Okay, I have a poem here, but first I want to read. I'm powerless, helpless, frustrated. I'm crying all the time. I'm brokenhearted. I'm sad. I'm angry. I'm crazed. I'm needy. I'm alone. I'm forgetful. I need to know if I can love and invest again. All those things. I've heard of all those things at some time or other. And we went through the herd. Do you remember the herd?
Yep.
Do you still have here?
Yes, I do.
Oh, good.
I always have it.
Okay. Read your herd.
My herd. Panic,
Yeah.
rage,
Yep.
empty, anger, heated,
Cheated.
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Helplessness, envy, and depression.
Right. We can be any of those things. We can be a combination of those. And we hate ourselves that we can't get ourselves under control. But that's part of it. So, dead or alive, I want to sum this up. Dead or alive, no such thing as dying. If the person is here, they're still hearing. You want to be able to talk to them. They don't have to talk back. They don't have to talk to you. And if you can't go in, there's called a phone. Call them. Let them hear your voice. You tell them how you feel, that you miss them. You tell them you hope that they're comfortable. Whatever you can tell them, and you can write that down if you think you're going to get excited about being on the telephone. You can be supportive of phone, notes, whatever, autograph book, music. You can enlist others to help, hold a candlelight service. The protest march can be representative of collective grief. Human loss over time, recent loss in time, generational losses, and with other losses is not just human loss. It's all the losses connected with life that we tend to process at one time. Thank you so much, Guillermo.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tony.